Hello and welcome to another video. Today we're going to be looking at items on Evelynn and how MR, HP, and so on affects what item choices are good, how we can interpret some of the numbers behind item choices, why a lot of these, let's say, conclusions that people draw from like doing math or whatever can be like a bit misleading, and how I can show that an item is both good and bad in a similar situation by doing the tests in a slightly different way. Okay, so let's get into it. First off, we have like the basic test, which is like the level 6. I wanted to go from all the way at level 6 with basically just having like a few items to having like level 11, 12, 13 items, full 5, 6 items, and so on, right? So some general ideas. I wanted to compare all of the options that you have, and obviously most of the options that you're gonna have are going to be in mid game, because in late game you're basically locked into a basic build where you need to have mythic, right? Because the mythic passive just gives you too much. It gives so much pen and AP that it's just not worth to not have, right? And then at the same time you need void staff because, well, void staff is just too good against MR. At the same time, you need Ravenons because Ravenons just gives too much AP, right? So the late game itemization is really broken down into a few main items that we can consider, namely those being namely those being Lichbane, Shadowflame, maybe Horizon, and some kind of combos where you don't have void staff because you don't need it. There's also like Cosmic and whatever, but those items just straight up do less damage, but they have like some kind of utility and they can be used in some scenarios, I suppose. So let's start off here though, from the start. So at level 6, I compared Darkseal Sorks, Blasting Wand, Amp Tome, and Darkseal, and Alternator Darkseal, right? And you would expect that since everyone recommends that you should go Darkseal and Sorks, or they say like go straight AP, that those things would just straight up be the best, right? Well, okay. So this is pretty interesting, right? So the numbers here show a full combo without charm, full combo with charm, without ult of course, just like Qs and E, and then like the ult damage with and without charm, right? So that's shown for all 3 examples. So from that you might conclude, okay, well, Blasting Wand, Amp Tome, and Darkseal seems like the best. It just has the highest numbers, right? Okay. Interesting. Okay. But this is 850 plus 435 plus 350. So this is actually a 1535 buy, right? In terms of gold. While this is a 1400 gold buy, and this is like a 1500 gold buy, right? So this is already interesting because 100 gold being the difference between these two, while the damage difference being not so high, right? I mean, the ult damage is pretty good, and at level 6 the ult damage does matter, right? So while there is a damage difference, if we equalize for gold, it's going to end up being pretty much the same. So that's pretty interesting, right? But then why do people say go Darkseal and Sorks? Like, okay, isn't this just bad then? Well, as you stack the Darkseal, the Darkseal value will not go up here. And what I mean by that is that here a lot of damage you get is the base damage from Alternator. So the base damage in this is going to be pretty good. Here a lot of the damage you get is from AP, right? So if you get more AP, your damage is going to go up, but it's not going to scale with itself. Well, here the damage you get is from Sorks, which is pen. And if you get pen and AP, then that ends up kind of multiplying between themselves. Same as if you get AD and attack speed. Like, if you just get attack speed or just AD, then okay, you conclude that one of those stats will just give you more damage, right? But at some point, mixing the stats just gives you straight up more damage, right? Because they multiply between each other, because you do X amount of attacks per second, and the attacks you X amount of damage, right? So, yeah. But also, a thing to note is that Sorks just give a lot of move speed. So since they give a lot of move speed, You can dodge spells, you can fight better, you can show up to plays faster, and so on, right? So quite a bit to unpack there instantly. And then if we compare the damages between Darksteel, Sorks, and Alternator Darksteel, it's pretty much the same, other than the fact that the Alternator gives you a little burst, right, that ends up showing up here. So at the end of the day, this is really a 30 damage difference, or less, right, between this and that. And here it's maybe like, okay, here it's like a bit more. So here we do have almost 100 damage as a difference, right? But at the same time, this is the most just straight raw AP. It's really good for farming as well, right? So the thing that this is really good on is farming, because in farming it doesn't matter that much what your move speed is. Nothing really changes too much. It's just like, okay, well, I hit my camps, I do this amount of damage, so I'm gonna clear at this speed, right? But fights can be a bit different, so it's kind of interesting, because here, for example, you have HP as well from the alternator, so in a fight, this is actually gonna end up being better than this oftentimes, right? In a straight up fight, it can be. Or this can also be better, but if you're just clearing camps, then this is going to end up being better. So this is why numbers are a bit misleading as well. That's like one of the reasons, because you have to actually get what the numbers mean, right? Like, what are they in a practical sense? So, but obviously all of these buys are perfectly reasonable, they're fine, and they're not really too problematic. Okay, so then I went for level 9, and obviously here I used low MR values, because I'm not really going to assume that someone rushed Mercs or something, or rushed Hex Drinker, because if someone rushed Mercs or rushed Hex Drinker, why are you even fighting them as Evelynn? That's like a question for you, not for me. So yeah. I decided to test these three things, so Sorks and AP components, versus just straight up Harvester versus straight up Rocket Belt. I didn't want to test Darksteel and stuff, because then it's like, you know, like, I have to like guess how many stacks you would have and whatever, and then if I do like Sorks in these items, then there's no point testing it against Sorks. So the interesting thing here was that you can see that all of these damages, I didn't split them like here, because the reason I split them up here is because I got the targets to 30% HP so that it would be execution, so the ult would actually have more of a difference, right? So this difference in the ult is actually if the ult executes. If it doesn't execute, then the difference is going to be smaller. But you try to get your ult to execute early game, so I did it that way. But here I just straight up full comboed in every scenario. So you can see that the damage difference is interesting. So Harvester is the worst one, which is kind of expected, because it's, I mean, it's just that item. Like, it gives move speed, like Burr, so fun dude, like resets, cool, CDR. It's give like fun stats, and it's also like pretty good if you already have a lot of damage. But damage wise, it's just not known for being that amazing of a damage item, right? While Sorks and Rocket Belt, which might surprise many of you, when you equalize for gold, so Sorks being 1100, then I bought, I believe, Blasting Wand, and I think I bought the Alternator. I think that's what I bought. You could also buy like 2 amp tomes or whatever the fuck, I don't know. Basically, the gold ended up being like really similar, right? So there wasn't too much of a difference between the gold values. I believe that this was even cheaper than this, so it ended up being like same damage, which kind of does point towards Sorks being rather good, right? Because if you can just get straight up free move speed, I mean, you get the active here, I suppose, but I use the active in the combos anyway, so this is like with the active, and this is just like straight up your damage. So another thing to note, I suppose, but the dash and the move speed from the rocket can be valuable, but... And you also get some HP here, and you probably get more HP here than you do here, but damage-wise, pretty much even, and being able to snowball with Sorks is really nice, and that's why I do like Sorks quite a lot, because while they do lack in damage a little bit here, they make up for it here. And they snowball really hard here. Okay, so then... Okay, so I guess we can go through my no Magi's tests. So I tested some builds without Magi. I didn't want to test too many because I don't care about it that much. But if any of you do prefer not to play Magi at all, then this is for you, right? So all of these do have Sorks included. So there's level 9, one item. This is just testing which item does the most damage at this time. The items ended up being pretty similar. I tested Rocket Belt, Rabadon's Shadow Flame, and Void Staff. They ended up being pretty similar. You might say, well, they're not actually similar. Like this thing and this thing does a lot less damage on the second combo. But the reason for that is because this got into execution range and this got into execution range on the ult, on the dummy, while these two just didn't reach it. But if they reached the execution range, then it's pretty much the same damage. So if someone in your team did say like 50 damage or something, or I don't know, whatever it was, like 70 or 80 or whatever it was, that these items were missing to reach the execution on this dummy, then it would end up being like really similar to this, and it's not too much of a difference. Also, you have to equalize for gold a little bit because this is 3600, this is 3200, this is 3000, and this is 2800, and the most expensive item, which also does the most damage, is actually it's actually quite a bit more gold. It's like 800 more, so yeah. Here you can see that the items end up really equalizing in damage because they just do the same thing, basically. Like, if you don't have Magi and stuff, and these items end up doing pretty much the same on first item. And in general, what I found from testing stuff is that even later on, it ended up being a situation where, actually, I think it was mostly here. I don't know if it was somewhere else. I don't want to look for it because then I'll make the video like really weird. It ended up being really similar. So the first item damage is actually like really balanced between like pretty much every item as Evelynn. Even if you want something like Lich Bane, it wouldn't be like that far off. So, I mean, it would be worse, but not that far. Lastly, we have like the highest MR I can imagine someone having at this time, like 100. I don't think that level 9 anyone should have more than 100 MR, and if they do, then I don't know why you're fighting them. That's just on you, my guy. I did tap this on yellow. The color coding is basically like yellow is like okay, it's like viable or situational based on the numbers. The green ones are just like the best damage numbers, right? Yellow just means, yeah, it could be good, like the damage is fine enough. The green just means like, yeah, it's like the best damage pretty much that you can get here. Or in context. And red just means that the damage is so lacking that it really needs to make it up in some other way for it to be worth it. So yeah. Yellow here, I believe, because Shadow Flame does not have that good builds on second, third item and so on, and you're really locked into a certain build, which makes it so you're like, yeah, questionable, right? Okay. So later on, I said, okay, so we have Rocket Belt and we have Rabadon's, right, as the first item. Why? Because these two items just straight up did the most damage out of all of these. You can also argue for Void Staff, but like Void Staff isn't good with like any item except Rabadon's. So like if you go Void Staff, then you're gonna go Rabadon's anyway. Maybe Void Staff. This sounds so grief. Like, I mean, Rocket Belt and Void Staff is not very good together. Like Rocket Belt, I mean, Void Staff and Rabadon's though is good together, so there isn't really much of a reason to test it on its own against other items, because then it's just gonna end up being like Rabadon's is just the best damage by far with Void Staff. So, okay, Rocket Belt, we have Rabadon's, Shadow Flame, Void Staff as the items. As you might expect, these items are not performing on low MR, but many of you might be surprised by this. Shadow Flame does not actually do well when the MR of the enemy is low. Why? Because it reaches the cap really quickly. If I have Rocket Belt, Sorks, and Shadow Flame, I'm pretty much doing true damage. So whenever I W, it does nothing. And whenever I don't W, I do fine damage. So we can mark this as yellow, actually, because it's kind of situational, I suppose. Because the damage does end up being like pretty similar to the Rabadon's damage. It's like similar enough, right? On the no W combo, but nah, I'll leave it as red, because if you use W, it just does nothing. So you're just lacking damage for no reason. So yeah. This thing, pretty much same, but it's like kind of scaling up. See, Shadow Flame is like scaling up. But the issue with Shadow Flame here was that it, without Charm, ended up not reaching the execution thresholds anymore. And it's still 200 damage down, so I just said, yeah, it's meh. This as well, same thing, like if you W, you're just like damage down because this is true damage, and you don't actually have enough AP to justify it because you don't have Magi, so yeah. Lastly, this is where the things equalize. So you can see that at some point, all of the items become like pretty similar or equal, right? And those are like kind of the breakpoints, and oftentimes that is going to end up being something like 100 MR. So at something like 100 MR, the items become really similar. And if you equalize for gold, so if you count in that Void Staff is 2800 and Providence is 3600, then Void Staff is actually the best performer here, and it's like the best value for your money at this point. While Shadow Flame is still the worst value for your money, low-key. But yeah, never really ends up being good here. So yeah, but Providence is just never bad. Like that's the thing. Like it's never really bad, but the problem is that it's so expensive that at some point you don't want it anymore, right? So that's something to keep in mind. But generally, this is the pattern where you get to like 100 MR and Void Staff starts to equalize at 150 and 200, and it just becomes like really good, especially when you don't use Charm. Shadow Flame has like a similar pattern. At 100 MR, it starts to like become decent. Then 150 MR, it starts to become like pretty good. And then as you keep going up, it straight up outscales stuff like Lich Bane. Then we did the other side of this, which is Providence. And this is something that I really found a lot while testing, where both here in the Magi tests and in the no Magi tests, what you can check is that it ends up being a situation where Rabadons and wait, where is it? Where's the no rocket? Ah, yeah, here. So Rabadons, just having Rabadons and then having like other items is going to be a lot more viable than maybe it's not so shown there. Oh yeah, here. Yeah, this shows it pretty well. Okay, so this one. So these two. So you have Rocket Belt with other items, and you have Providence with other items, right? With full combo. So what ends up happening is that when you have Providence, like all of the other items become all of the other items become like really kind of viable. While when you have Rocket Belt, then pretty much the only thing that becomes viable is Providence, because everything else is just kind of bad at that point, right? Like whenever you have Rocket Belt, but you don't have Providence yet, everything else just gets like really outclassed by it, like really, really outclassed. So that's like a common theme that we found. Yeah. So here it's like a similar thing. When you have Providence, you have like a lot of options. So you can go Void Staff with Providence when enemies hire more. You can go Shadow Flame or Rocket Belt, and they end up being pretty much the same early on. But the problem is that Shadow Flame will not keep scaling. So when you buy the next item after this item, this will get really outclassed, while this will not. This will keep scaling. So this ends up being better. But it shows you that having Providence already in your inventory makes the champion have more options in terms of what you want to do compared to something like Rocket Belt. And that's why I always tell you that, yeah, you can just go like a few builds and it's pretty much, oh yeah, well, you buy this item or you buy this item or you buy this item. And then you're just going to buy like the other ones, right? One thing to note is that I tested Banshee only once and it was here. Obviously, it gets outscaled by everything because it's not a damage item, it's a defensive item. So don't really need to worry about that too much, because the reason you're buying Banshee is not for the highest damage numbers. I just tested it here so that you will get a comparison between having it and having other items, so you can make more educated decisions in terms of if it's worth it for you or not in your current situation. Okay, so let's chill a bit. Here we have, what is this? Oh yeah, this is like high stack Magi versus low stack Magi. So 24 versus 12. So this is when you buy Magi and it's just like, yeah, you have a full Dark Seal and you buy it. And this is where you already stacked it, right? So what's the difference? Not too much. Either way, Ravenance becomes the best. Rocket Belt is always worse than Rabadon's, so anytime you do have Magi, Rabadon's is just like the best item you can possibly have. Shadow Flame is pretty decent though this is earlier on, so the enemies are not expected to have so much MR, but even if they did have MR, Rocket Belt would not really end up outscaling. It would take like a lot of MR for the pen from Rocket Belt to outscale Rabadon's, so yeah. Even if we adjust it for price, so we add an Amp Tome here, this will still get outclassed by Rabadon's, so yeah, an interesting discovery there. Shocking, I know. Interestingly enough, though, I want to mention this. Void Staff is actually not too bad. Like, even just having Magi Void Staff is not too bad, but the enemy does need to have more MR than this. Like, this is just too low, right? But it's pretty good. So, Shadow Flame and Rabadon's can both do, like, really well, but Rabadon's is just more open to every item, so this kind of shows you why the builds that I go for and the builds I recommend are as they are. Rocket Belt is just easy to build because buying Rabadon's is not so easy unless you have a lot of gold on bases or snowballing really hard, in which case it's actually the build I prefer. I just go Magi and Rabadon's and I'm chilling. But Rocket Belt is just the easiest item to buy because the components are always like 400 gold, so on every base you have something to buy, right? Pretty self-explanatory. Okay, so let's get into this first. I think this is pretty good to look at. So now we have Rocket Belt Magi with stacks, Rabadon's Magi with stacks, and then something with low stacks. But let's compare these two first. So we have Rocket Belt Magi with high stacks and Rabadon's Magi with higher stacks. So this is what I meant by also nothing is really very viable if you have Rocket Belt, except Rabadon's, because look at the damage difference. Like, at low MR, this thing straight up does like 400 to 700 more damage than other things. The second closest item, here, it's like the closest with Charm, it's 600 less. 600. You're not getting that from any Amp Tomes. Like, you can buy 10 Amp Tomes if you want, you're not getting that. I mean, okay, 10 you will, but I mean, you know what I mean. You know what I mean. It's just not really gonna happen, and this is like the closest item in terms of non-W damage, and it's 400 down, so just horrifyingly bad. When you do get a lot of MR, Void Staff does scale up, so Void Staff does actually end up both matching and outclassing Rabadon's, so pretty cool there. Already at 100 MR, it's pretty much equal because it does more when you don't charm and it does a bit less when you do charm, but we can just say it's equalized. So with Rocket Belt having White Staff is actually really good with Magi, so you can consider this item a bit more, especially if people have like this kind of MR, because people actually do underbuy this and they overbuy Rabadon's, and these items just don't even buy. Like, do not buy this garbage. You're really ill if you buy this. I'll like make this a bit bigger so it's like easier to see. It's really not okay. It's really, really not okay. Like, just look. No matter where you look, it's just not nice. It's just not nice to look at. The damage you lose is just insane. The funny thing is that the Banshee damage loss, like, people will complain like, oh yeah, well, if you go Banshee, you actually do less damage or something, you know? Like, some people will say stuff like that, but look at this. I mean, it's like the same. You don't even do that much less damage. Like, the difference between Banshee and Lich Bane or Shadow Flame or something is like 100, 200 damage. The difference between going Lich Bane, Shadow Flame, and Rabadon's is like 600, 700 damage. So, if you ever complain about Banshee doing less damage than this shit, I don't know, you're just ill if you don't go this then. That's all I can say. But yeah. Okay, so this is also the pattern with the pattern that I talked about, right? So Rabadon's just has a lot more viable items then. So Rocket Belt does do really well when you have a well-stacked Magi, but Shadow Flame still does fine, Void Staff still does well. Lich Bane doesn't do well until like 5th, 6th item, which is what I've been telling people for a while. This item just does not compete because, look here, it's behind 400 damage on the non-charm combo, and this is like the best case scenario for you because this is 50 MR, which is less MR than people have as base MR at like level 13, 14 or something. Like, okay, I mean, people tend to have like 50 something MR, but even if they had 50, you're still getting out damaged. So don't recommend. Do not recommend. I mean, it's good for multi-kills if you're like really fed, but still you might as well just buy it later. Okay, for a slight interesting comparison, I also added a lower stack comparison where you can see that with Rocket Belt, this stuff is still not viable, but something like just going Rocket Belt Rabadon's is really good then. And you can see that Rabadon's Void Staff, while it's actually like really good, it's really good usually, here it doesn't end up actually outscaling Rocket Belt until quite a lot of MR. It's actually better here though, especially because you don't need to rely on actives and you do like a decent amount more damage, and it's cheaper as well, so you actually get even a compensation amp tome here, and the damage without charm is actually like much higher. So yeah, this thing is actually better as well. It's actually a green one, actually, my bad. Because this is cheaper than this as well, because you only spent 3,200 in Rocket Belt and you spent 3,600 in Rabadon, so after compensation, this ends up being equal, pretty much. So, okay. Yep, pretty much the same pattern as usual. Okay, but, okay, so I said I would show you how numbers are a bit deceptive, right? And how they don't really tell you the full story, and why, even though people like to test for numbers and stuff, they tell you the numbers. Like, even if they do tell you the numbers, right? Like, they might not even tell you the numbers and just say something is better than something else, in which case you just have to trust them. Even if they do tell you the numbers, right? And you can make your own decision. Okay, which items do you trust, right? Like, which numbers? So here, I can show you that Rise and Focus actually does the most damage. When you have a 24 stack Magi with Rocket Belt, Rabadons, and Void, so you have your core items, having a Rise and Focus is actually the highest damage item you can buy. Until 200 MR. But before 200 MR, it's the highest damage item you can buy. So does that mean that we should all go for Rise and Focus? Well, proccing it is not really an issue because you can smite for it as far as I know. Or you can use like the short W, so slows do apply it, so not really an issue, right? What is the issue though? Well, okay, it seems like pretty good here, right? But then let's look at this. So what I meant by combos is combos like Qs and Es or Qs and Es with W. And now look at what this item does. Rise and Focus, red, just nothing. And why is that? Well, because this item gives you 10% extra damage, right? And a bunch of AP. So your highest AP ratio is your ult. And 10% extra damage on an ult that does like 2000, it's going to be quite a lot of damage, right? But the issue is that the damage doesn't actually mean anything, because if you're doing 2000 damage with your ult, then you're probably killing things easily anyway. So, a really easy thing, okay, this is Lich Bane, this is not Horizon, like it's not lined up, so don't look at this, just these. A really simple way to show that while numbers can actually be higher on certain items, it doesn't mean that the items are actually better, whether that be because of utility, or because that be because of usability, or that be because the items just straight up are not better, or other reasons. Here the reason being because the damage that you do before your ult is more important on Evelynn than the damage you do after your ult, or well, during your ult, I suppose I should say. Yeah. Okay, so how do I want to... I guess we can go through the combos now. So, okay, this is with Rocket Belt, your... Okay, this is a comparison between Rocket Belt and Ravdance. So, which items will do what? This is also what I meant by more items being viable if you have Ravdance and if you have Rocket Belt, and why I also don't give you so many options usually to go for like random items. Like why I tell people like, yeah, don't go Lich Bane, don't go this and don't go that, right? So if you go Rocket Belt and then you go Lich Bane, you are doing around 400 less damage pretty much always. 300, 400. As you can see here, compared to like Ravdance. You can add in amp tomes and say like, yeah, but actually I get compensation because it's cheaper. You're getting like an amp tome, my guy, like an amp tome and a half maybe. In which case you're still doing 200-300 less damage. So if you really want to go on an item that's cheaper, then you might as well go Void Staff, because Void Staff is actually doing the same damage as your Lich Bane, pretty much. But it scales better into MR, and people are usually not going to have 60 MR, because that's pretty much base MR at level, I don't know, 14 or something for a lot of champs. And if champs have MR in runes, or they buy Merc Threads or something, they're instantly going to be a decent amount above it. Revenance is always the best though, as you might expect, until you get like at least 150 MR, which is what we already figured out here. This is actually a bit deceptive as well, because the Revenance damage is actually going to get outscaled even more here, because the Void Staff does not benefit as much from the ult having a high AP ratio. Though it does benefit from the ult having high damage, so maybe it's still even. I'm not sure about that actually, exactly, so shouldn't say that, I suppose. But yeah. So, what you'll notice is that when you do have Ravdance though, Shadowflame and Lich Bane become much more viable. Why is that? Well, because Shadowflame has a decent amount of AP, which feeds into the Ravdance, and it has Pen, which is good if you already have damage, right? So both do pretty well into this. Lich Bane just gets fed off the Ravdance high AP, so you end up being like 500 at least AP with these items, so it ends up actually being viable. And this is pretty much the pattern. After that, if we say that we already have our core items, so there isn't really a point in not having Mythic later, as I said, because at some point it just starts giving you like 20 pen for free, and it's just nothing can really compete with that. Like 20 pen and having a decent amount of AP and an active and whatever, can't compete, cannot. So here you can see that some items have a pretty interesting breakpoint in MR. So for example, Lich Bane has a breakpoint around 50 to 60 MR, where it's really good. And then it ends up being like a bit more awkward. While something like Horizon Focus is only really good at really low MRs, right? Like it has to be like really low and it's decent. But even then you might as well buy Lich Bane because it gives you move speed, and move speed is just a better stat than HP, while they both give you CDR. Right. Void Staff just very good. This is why a lot of Evelynn's default to Void Staff, but it's not always the best, because Lich Bane, as you can see, is the best here. And while you might think that Void Staff is the best here, it's actually Shadowflame with Charm. Go figure. Though after equalizing for gold, this will end up being a decent amount better, so Void Staff is better anyway, and the cutoff ends up being something like probably 80 MR or whatever, where Void Staff starts to really outshine the Lich Bane value. And then later on, when you already have Void Staff, then you can see that Lich Bane just becomes the best item. Why? Well, because it does the most before you ult, right? Shadowflame Lich is also really good. This is a replacement for Void Staff, and it actually ends up being better, but only at really low MRs. So if the enemy literally didn't buy MR, and you're a 6-item Evelynn, then wow, Shadowflame Void Lich Bane, it's your time. The two items that like most of the high level mains like hate, you can finally build them together even. So pretty cool, right? And also if you W here, it's like fine as well. So situationally, this is actually really good, right? But it's only good if the enemy has like 1 or 2 people with 100 MR that you can W, so like bruisers or something, and the rest of the enemy team buys 0 MR. Otherwise, you might as well just default to Lich Bane, and it's going to do really well. But okay, if we break it down, right, it starts to really sound like what I have been telling people, where you might as well just go anything here, but I prefer Darkseal and Sorex because of utility. And then you might as well just hard prioritize Rocket Belt and Rabadons, because these items are just good. Like Rabadons is just the most damage, and Rocket Belt is just easiest to buy while being high damage. And then when you buy Rocket Belt, then unless you're really forced to, if the enemy is not stacking MR, right, you just go for Rabadons, right? And the numbers really show that really well. Like, you might as well just go it. And then, when you already have Rabadons, we can see that, I mean, it's like here, right? So when you already have Rocket Belt, Magi, and Rabadons, it's just like, okay, sometimes you can edge out some numbers with this, but then you might as well just default, right? You might as well just default to Lich Bane against low MR and Void Staff against higher MR. They build any MR, just go Void Staff. They don't build any MR, just go Lich Bane, right? Right. And then lastly, you might as well just go, if you want damage, right, you might as well just go Lich Bane, because it's just always good at the end, like 6th. Which also shows why, Lich Bane is just not good 2nd, not good 3rd, not good 4th, okay 5th. Like, okay. It's like, okay, right? Where is it? That's 5th, like here, right? It still gets pretty much out damaged if enemy goes any kind of MR, but at least it does quite a lot. The enemy's 50. This is like a little note though. Against Shadow Flame comparison for Lich Bane, if you don't have Void Staff, it's pretty much the closer the enemy is to 50 MR, the more Lich Bane does, while the closer the enemy is to 60 MR, the more Shadow Flame does. And if they're above that, you might as well just go Void Staff. I think around like 70 or 80 MR, you might as well just go Void Staff. But Shadow Flame is still fine, so if the enemy doesn't have too much MR and you don't have Void Staff, then Shadow Flame is fine. But if you have Void Staff and the enemy does have MR, then Shadow Flame is actually really good. So this is another little surprise for many of you, because you would think, okay, well, flat pen, so that means I want to go this item when the enemy doesn't have MR, right? But you get so much pen that it actually ends up being 100 MR when this thing starts even doing anything compared to other items. And even here, you can see that if you use W, then all the other items end up doing more damage. Well, except Shadow Flame plus Lich combo. But even Shadow Flame plus Lich combo does like the most damage even when you do use W. So the reality ends up being that you need to wait until like 130 MR at least for the Shadow Flame item to really do a lot if you already have Lich Bane and Rabadons and Rocket Belt and Magi, right? Which you should have anyway, because these items are just higher value. Because if we look at the value of Shadow Flame early on, it's just pretty much always red. It's like fine with Rabadons, but this is just fine. Like you can see, if you compare, it's not even outperforming Rocket Belt, and it's getting outscaled, so do not. Alright. And the best part is that actually this item ends up being the highest value. So this is something that many of you probably won't realize. It ends up being by far the highest value when the enemy approaches like 200 MR. So many people think that you go Lich Bane when people stack a lot of MR, but it's actually this, because when you go W them, Even if you don't W, it does more, but when you W them, it just does a shit ton more damage. And why? Because your Void Staff and W, right? Your W shredding like, let's say 40% MR, so it's easier to calculate, makes enemies lose 80 MR, which puts them at like 120. So then, okay, then the Void Staff is shredding another, let's say that it's another like 50 or something, right? So they're at 70, and then you already have like I don't know, like 50 pen from your items, right? I don't know, and sudden impact and stuff. You end up having them at like 20, so this ends up pretty much doing true damage when they're low HP or shielded. So pretty amazing. And you have to keep in mind that, oh my god, man, why do you do this? And you have to keep in mind that this is unshielded. Like none of these numbers with Shadow Flame are when when the enemy is shielded. All of them, the pen only maxes when the dummy is low HP. And I did keep adding some HP to the dummy, but it mostly just adds damage if you're Evelynn, so yeah. But pretty much I just matched or undercut the HP that you have as Evelynn by a little bit based on the level that you're at. So sometimes it might be a bit less HP that you're fighting or a bit more, but it's just a general thing. And yeah, we got through all of this. It took like a little bit to get through it, but it also took a little bit to make it. But I hope that this kind of gives you both an insight into what you should buy on Evelynn, and also an insight into kind of when you should buy it. But most importantly, it should give you a way to visualize why these items are good or bad and why they're recommended or not recommended. And Banshee is just always recommended because it's just a utility defensive item, right? So we don't care about this. We don't care. But this is why when I tell you to buy items, right, it ends up being like, okay, well, buy Rocket Belt no matter what, because, or well, buy the Rocket Belt or Harvester. Harvester if you're like 20 kills and smurfing, but otherwise just buy Rocket Belt. Swords because pen just good. Magi because the item just gives you a shit ton. I mean, you can also go no Magi, which is fine. We included that, but the ideas stay like pretty much the same. When you go no Magi, it's not really that different, but Shadow Flame gains some value because you're missing some AP at some points. Okay. Then you need Ravenons because you can see that during this whole spreadsheet, the most common pattern in the world is that Ravenons is just almost always green. Like it's just almost always what you want. You just want it. Like you don't actually care that much about Rocket Belt compared to Ravenons. Like Rocket Belt gets matched by some other items, but Ravenons just doesn't. This item just does too much on your champion. So you have to get this, and then okay, well Void Staff is just OP if enemy has more than like 100 MR, and who doesn't buy at least a Hex Shrinker against Evelynn? Hex Shrinker mercs, and they're already at that cutoff. So unless enemy buys 0 MR, it's Void Staff as well locked in, right? And then what do we have last? We have options. Banshee, defensive item. Lich Bane, offensive item. And then, funnily enough, I didn't really recommend people do this because then you have to actually look at the enemy's MR, but Shadow Flame, if they have more than 150 MR, is actually good. (150 plus MR, most damage. Under 150 MR, most damage, and then defense. And these items are also here. So if you don't go Void Staff, it's like same shit, right? And this item, because you don't actually care about damage always, is also here. Right? And this is pretty much the TLDR of itemization of Evelynn that both I and others recommend, right? I can also maybe link the spreadsheet somewhere, but I don't know. Maybe I'll link it if I remember. Probably won't remember, but if someone reminds me, I'll probably link it. But what you can see is that these items are going to at some point come true. Maybe you don't buy this, but okay. Most people will buy this stuff, and then this is just must buy at some point. Like if you don't buy this now, then you're gonna end up buying it here or here. Because it's not like you're not gonna buy it, right? So the only thing that really changes is the order of items here, and you really only have 3 optional items. And most people don't even like. I've never ever seen anyone use this like this, where they think, yeah, high MR on. Okay, I will go Shadow Flame. Like I've never seen this in my life. So in the end, it ends up pretty much being like these 2 items at the end of your build. But I mean, if nothing else, then you learned that Shadow Flame is good against people with high MR when you already have Void Staff, so you took away something from this video at least. Either way, if you enjoyed the video, then like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Peace. Oh, wait, also, I have to mention, you can still apply here to get free coaching if you meet conditions. Okay, no, peace. Bye.